The air inside the stagecoach was a stale mixture of sweat-cheap perfume and the fine, gritty dust that seeped through every crack in the swaying frame. Jack Callahan sat alone, his back pressed against the worn leather, a man apart from the nervous chatter of the other passengers. His gaze was fixed on the blur of the high desert passing by the window, but he saw none of it. He saw only the shimmering haze of memory, the ghosts that rode with him wherever he went. The landscape outside was a study in desolation. Cracked earth stretched to the horizon, interrupted only by skeletal saguaros raising thorny arms to a merciless eggshell blue sky. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the distant mesas in shades of blood and violet. It was a beautiful, brutal land that promised nothing and took everything. A portly salesman across from him mopped his brow with a stained handkerchief. "Lord have mercy, it's hotter than the devil's own forge out there." He wheezed to the woman beside him, a preacher's wife, with a face pinched by judgment. She offered a tight, unsympathetic smile. Jack remained silent. His words were a currency he had long since learned to conserve. His stillness was a fortress, the walls built from years of grief, and a solitude so profound it had become a second skin. He wore the dust of the trail like a shroud, his face weathered into a mask of grim endurance. His eyes holding the flat, distant look of a man watching a past he could never escape. His hand rested on his thigh, inches from the Colt Peacemaker, holstered there, a relic of a life he had tried to bury. He hadn't fired it in years, but he cleaned it obsessively, the ritual of familiar prayer to a God who had long ago stopped listening. The sudden crack of a rifle shot shattered the afternoon's oppressive quiet. Wood splintered from the coach's frame. The preacher's wife screamed, a thin, piercing sound. The horses shrieked in terror, their panicked neighs swallowed by a fresh volley of gunfire. The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing the passengers against one another as the driver fought for control. The salesman yelped as his head struck the ceiling. "We're being robbed," he bellowed, his face pale with a mixture of shock and indignation. Through the window, Jack saw them, a dozen riders materializing from the shimmering heat haze, their faces obscured by bandanas. They moved with a disciplined brutality that spoke of more than simple banditry. These were not desperate men. They were hunters. The coach careened off the trail, a wheel shattering against a rock with a sound like breaking bone. It tilted, hung suspended for a heart-stopping second, and then crashed onto its side, skidding to a halt in a cloud of choking dust. Inside it was chaos. Groans of pain mixed with prayers and sobs. Jack braced for the impact, was the first to move. He kicked open the door above him, his movements economical and precise. He ignored the salesman's blubbering pleas for help and hauled himself out of the wreckage. The outlaws had already surrounded them, their horses circling like vultures. They dismounted, rifles held steady. One of them yanked the wounded driver from his perch and threw him to the ground. Another tore open the strongbox with a crowbar, tossing bags of mail aside to get to the payroll within. But their leader did not move. He sat astride a powerful black stallion, a figure of absolute authority. He was a tall man dressed in a tailored black coat that seemed to mock the blistering heat. He lowered his bandana, and Jack felt the air leave his lungs. It was Silas Kane. The face was leaner, harder than Jack remembered, etched with lines of cruelty that hadn't been there a decade ago. But the eyes were the same, intelligent, cold, and burning, with a dark, theatrical wit. Kane's gaze swept over the scene of panicked passengers and broken luggage, then settled on Jack with an unnerving, predatory focus. A slow smile spread across his lips, a chilling expression that held no warmth, only recognition. "Well, well," Kane said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. It was a cultivated voice, laced with a menacing charm. "Jack Callahan. I had heard you'd crawled off to die somewhere. To think you'd deliver yourself to me. The Lord does work in mysterious ways. His men paused their attention, shifting from the loot to the quiet man standing beside the wrecked coach. They sensed the shift in the air, the sudden charge of a history far more volatile than a simple robbery. Jack said nothing. His hand instinctively went to the locket tucked inside his shirt, a small silver weight against his skin. It was all he had left. Kane dismounted his boots, crunching on the gravel as he approached. He moved with an unhurried grace, a showman playing to an audience only he could see. "You look diminished, Marshal. The years have not been kind. But then, kindness is a mercy neither of us has ever been afforded, is it?" He stopped a few feet from Jack, his eyes raking over him with contempt. "We'll take the payroll, of course. A man must fund his passions. But I came looking for something else. Something you have." One of Kane's men, a brutish thug with a scarred face, stepped forward and leveled his rifle at Jack's chest. "He ain't got nothing, boss? Just a dusty coat and an old pistol." "Patience," Abel Kane murmured, never taking his eyes off Jack. "Our former marshal has always been a man of hidden treasures." With a flick of his wrist, Kane drew a gleaming Bowie knife. He didn't point it at Jack. He used the tip to gesture delicately toward Jack's shirt. "That, for instance. A man like you doesn't carry keepsakes unless they bleed when you touch them. Let's see it." Jack's body went rigid. Every instinct honed by years of law enforcement and survival screamed at him to draw his weapon. But he was one man against a dozen. It would be suicide. And Silas Kane did not want him dead. Not yet. Death would be too simple, too merciful. "Give it to him," Kane ordered the thug. Abel stepped forward and ripped open Jack's shirt, the buttons scattering in the dust. The silver locket on its thin chain was exposed, glinting in the harsh sunlight. Abel tore it from Jack's neck, the chain snapping and biting into his skin. He handed it to Kane. Silas Kane held the locket in his palm, studying it as if it were a rare jewel. He pressed the clasp, and it sprang open. Inside were two miniature hand-painted portraits, a woman with a gentle smile and kind eyes, and a little girl with a ribbon in her hair, her expression one of bright, innocent joy. Mary and Sarah. "Ah," Kane breathed a soft, terrible sound of satisfaction. "I remember their faces. From the newspapers. Such a tragedy." He looked up, his eyes locking with Jack's, and the mask of civility fell away, revealing the bottomless well of hatred beneath. "I want you to feel it, Callahan. Just a fraction of it. The emptiness. The silence where a laugh used to be. I want you to know what it is to have everything taken from you." He closed the locket with a decisive snap. He did not pocket it. Instead, with cold, deliberate ceremony, he held it up for Jack to see one last time before dropping it into the dust and grinding it under the heel of his boot. The soft silver bent and twisted the delicate hinge, breaking with a sickening crunch. He then picked up the ruined object and slipped it into his coat pocket. A wave of pure black rage washed over Jack, so powerful it threatened to consume him. It was a physical force, hotter than the desert sun. He lunged forward, a raw, guttural cry tearing from his throat, his hand flying to his Colt. He never cleared the holster. Abel's rifle butt slammed into the side of his head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and Jack crumpled to the ground, the taste of blood and dust filling his mouth. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Silas Kane mounting his horse, the ruined locket, a trophy in his possession. Kane looked down at him, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. "This is not revenge," Marshal Kane said, his voice a low, chilling promise. "This is justice, and it has only just begun." He spurred his horse, and he and his men galloped away, leaving behind a wrecked stagecoach, wounded men, and Jack Callahan, broken and bleeding in the unforgiving dust of the West. He was stripped not just of his last possession, but of the very memory it was meant to protect. Jack drifted back to consciousness on a current of pain. His head throbbed with a vicious rhythmic beat, and every breath was a fire in his ribs. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The sun was lower now, casting long, distorted shadows across the ravaged scene. The other passengers were huddled together, tending to the wounded driver. The salesman was on his knees, vomiting into a scrubby bush. No one looked at Jack. It was as if his personal humiliation had created a field of contagion around him. He staggered to his feet, his hand going to his neck where the locket used to be. The raw, empty space felt like a fresh wound. Cain hadn't just stolen a piece of silver. He had stolen the heart of his grief, the one tangible thing that connected him to the life he had lost. Without it, he was just a shell haunted by ghosts he could no longer see. He knew where Cain was headed. There was only one place in this godforsaken territory a man like Silas Cain could build a fortress and rule like a king the San Roque Valley. And at its heart lay the dusty, forgotten town of Cedar Falls. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Jack began to walk. Each step was an agony, but it was fueled by a singular burning purpose. He wasn't a marshal anymore. He wasn't a husband or a father. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous thing in the desert. He would get the locket back. He would face Silas Cain, and this time, justice would be his. The journey to Cedar Falls was a pilgrimage through hell. He walked for 2 days, the sun a hammer against his skull. By night, the desert cold seeped into his bones. He had no water, no food, only the bitter taste of rage to sustain him. He followed the dusty track, a ghost moving through a landscape of ghosts. He stumbled into Cedar Falls near dusk on the second day, a scarecrow figure held together by sheer will. The town was even more desolate than he remembered. It wasn't just dusty, it was dying. Buildings sagged their windows like vacant eyes. A chilling silence hung in the air, thicker than the dust. The saloon doors were shut, and the general store looked shuttered, and the few people on the street hurried along with their heads down, refusing to meet his gaze. This was a town under siege, not by Apaches or bandits, but by a fear so pervasive it had become the air they breathed. He made his way to the livery, the only place that showed any sign of life. A single lamp glowed in the window of the small attached house. He pushed open the heavy stable doors. The scent of hay and horse was a small, clean comfort in a world gone foul. A woman emerged from the shadows of a stall, a pitchfork held loosely in her hands. She was young, but her face was etched with a weary strength that made her seem older. Her dark hair was pulled back from a face that was proud and defiant, but her eyes held a deep, quiet sorrow that Jack recognized immediately. She was heavily pregnant, her condition a stark symbol of life in this town of creeping death. "We're closed," she said, her voice steady but tired. "I'm not looking for a horse," Jack rasped, his throat raw. "Information. I'm looking for Silas Cain." The woman's posture stiffened. The name hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. She took a step back, her hand moving to rest protectively on her swollen belly. Never heard of him. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her fear was a palpable thing. "He has something of mine," Jack said, his voice low and intense. "I aim to get it back." She studied him. Then her gaze taking in his bruised face, his ripped shirt, the desperate fire in his eyes. She saw not a drifter, but a man pushed past his limit. Something in her expression softened a flicker of empathy, breaking through the fear. "You're bleeding?" she said, lowering the pitchfork. She gestured to a water pump in the corner of the stable. "You can clean up. But you should know, mister," The man you're looking for owns this town. He owns the valley. He owns the fear in everyone's eyes. Looking for him is the same as looking for your own grave. I've been dead for years, Jack said, his voice hollow. I'm just here to collect my property. He moved to the pump, but the simple act of working the handle sending waves of pain through his body. As the cold water splashed over his face, washing away the blood and grime, he met the woman's eyes in the gathering gloom. She had not run. She had not turned him away. In a town that had surrendered its soul, she was the first person to show him a spark of humanity. My name is Eliza Reyes, she said quietly. And you should leave Cedar Falls before Silas Kane finds out you're here. He doesn't leave loose ends. Jack Callahan, he replied, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. And I'm not the loose end, I'm the reckoning. The only place Jack could find to hole up was an abandoned assay office at the edge of town. It was little more than a shack, the wind whistling through the gaps in the plank walls. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and for now that was enough. He sat on the dusty floor, his back against the wall, and let the pain and exhaustion wash over him. Sleep, when it came, was not a reprieve. It was a descent. He was back in the sun-drenched yard of his small ranch outside of Durango. Mary was hanging laundry, her laughter like wind chimes. She turned and smiled at him, the locket he'd given her for their 5th anniversary gleaming at her throat. Jack Come See Sarah learned a new word. His daughter, barely 4 years old, came running toward him, her small legs pumping a bright red ribbon in her blonde curls. Papa, she squealed, throwing her arms around his legs. Papa Flower. She pointed a chubby finger at a wildflower she clutched in her fist. The idyllic scene fractured the blue sky, bleeding to a bruised twilight. The scent of laundry and wildflowers was replaced by the acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke. He was a U.S. Marshal again, leading a posse through the rocky canyons of the San Roque Valley. The intelligence had been solid, he'd been told. A small gang of rustlers, easy to flush out. His deputy, Marcus Thorne, a young, eager man he'd trusted like a brother, rode beside him. They're holed up in that box canyon, Marshal Thorne had said, pointing. Just like the informant said. We go in hard and fast, they won't know what hit 'em. But the intelligence was wrong. It wasn't a small gang. And they weren't rustlers. They were Silas Kane's men, and it was an ambush. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs above. Men and horses screamed. The raid was a disaster, a bloody, chaotic failure. They'd retreated, leaving 2 of their own behind. Jack remembered the shame, the fury. But there was something else, a detail that always snagged in his memory like a thorn. During the firefight, a stray shot had struck a small hidden cabin nestled in the canyon. He'd seen a lamp explode inside, heard a woman's cry cut short. At the time, in the heat of battle, it was just collateral damage. A tragic accident. The dream shifted again, twisting into his darkest nightmare. He was riding home 2 weeks after the failed raid. He saw the smoke from miles away, a black pillar staining the sky. He spurred his horse, a cold dread coiling in his gut. The yard was silent. The front door of his home was splintered, hanging off its hinges. Inside was a slaughterhouse. Mary and Sarah. He found them in the kitchen. They had been killed, not with the cold efficiency of an outlaw, but with the intimate brutality of a man fueled by a grief as vast and terrible as Jack's own would soon become. On the wall, scrawled in his wife's blood, was a single word: justice. He woke with a strangled cry, his body drenched in sweat. The dream was always the same, a relentless loop of his greatest love and his deepest failure. He sat there in the dark shack, the silence of the ghost town pressing in on him. and the guilt was a physical weight threatening to crush him. He had failed to protect his family. His actions, his botched raid, had led a monster to his door. He wasn't just a victim of Silas Cain. He was his creator. And there was a nagging inconsistency in the memory, a piece that never fit. The informant who gave them the location of Cain's hideout was never found. Marcus Thorne, who had vouched for the informant, had been devastated by the outcome, resigning his commission a month later, disappearing from Jack's life. It was a loose thread in the tapestry of his grief, one he had never had the strength to pull. Days bled into a week. Jack moved through Cedar Falls like a wraith, gathering information in the whispers and fragments. He learned that Cain's men were everywhere, their presence a constant low-grade threat. They controlled the water, the supply lines, and the law, such as it was. Cain himself remained secluded in his fortified ranch, a sprawling compound carved out of the valley floor referred to by the townsfolk only as the Sanctuary. His path kept crossing with Eliza Reyes. He found himself drawn to the quiet defiance of her livery. It was the only business in town that hadn't been bought or broken by Cain. He would stop by under the pretense of needing water, and they would talk. Or rather, she would talk, and he would listen. "My husband, Mateo, built this place with his own hands," she told him one afternoon, her hands methodically braiding a horse's mane. He believed in this town, believed it could be something more than just a place to pass through. "What happened to him?" Jack asked, his voice still rough from disuse. Cain's men tried to get him to sell. Mateo refused. There was an accident a few months later. A stallion crushed him against a stall. The doctors said it was a freak occurrence. But that stallion had always been gentle as a lamb with Mateo. She didn't have to say more. The implication hung heavy in the air. Now Cain's man, Mr. Thorne, comes by every week with a new offer. Says it's not safe for a woman alone. Says he's just looking out for my welfare. The name hit Jack like a physical blow, Thorne. Marcus Thorne, she confirmed. Cain's right-hand man. A quiet man, always dressed neat. Has a nervous habit of flipping a silver dollar. The world tilted. A silver dollar. Marcus had always done that, a tick he'd had since he was a boy. The loose thread in his memory suddenly became a thick, choking rope around his neck. It couldn't be a coincidence. Eliza saw the look on his face. "You know him?" Jack couldn't speak. He just nodded, his mind reeling. The betrayal was an idea so vast, so monstrous, he could barely comprehend it. Marcus, his protege, his friend. Had he led them into that ambush on purpose? Had he sold them out? And if so, why was he now at Cain's side? Over the next few days, their conversations deepened. Eliza spoke of her unborn child, of her hope for a future free from fear. Her quiet strength was a balm on his raw nerves. She didn't pry into his past, but her gentle probing questions slowly chipped away at the fortress he had built around himself. "That locket," she said one evening as they shared a meager meal of beans and stale bread in her small home. "It must have been very important to you." He found himself telling her about Mary and Sarah, the words rusty and painful. It was the first time he had spoken their names to another soul in years. As he spoke, he realized he wasn't just fighting for a piece of silver anymore. He was fighting for the memory itself, for the right to grieve. Eliza listened without judgment, her own loss creating a space of shared understanding between them. In her presence, the crushing weight of his guilt lessened just for a moment. He saw in her and her unborn child a flicker of the life he had lost, a reason to fight for something more than just revenge. Jack knew he couldn't storm Cain's ranch alone. He needed to understand Cain's strategy to find a weakness. He began to track Cain's men, shadowing them from the rocky bluffs overlooking the valley. What he saw made no sense. They weren't acting like ranchers or outlaws. They carried strange equipment transits, surveyors' chains, wooden stakes. They weren't fortifying the valley. They were mapping it. He followed a pair of them to a desolate patch of land miles from the main ranch. It was a barren plot worthless for grazing or farming. Yet the men spent hours driving stakes into the ground, taking meticulous measurements. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Jack returned to the site. He found one of the stakes and saw it was marked with a date and a name, J. Miller. Cold dread washed over him. Jed Miller had been a member of his posse, a good man killed in the ambush. He spent the next 2 nights tracking the surveyors. Each plot they marked corresponded to land owned by a former member of his posse men who had been killed in the raid or had left the territory in disgrace afterward. The properties formed a distinct pattern, a ring around the valley closing in on a single point. And that point was the barren, rocky ground where Kane's family cabin had stood. The place where they had died. He sought out the only man in Cedar Falls who might know more, an old prospector named Silas, who spent his days in a drunken stupor. Jack found him behind the saloon, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey. It took a silver dollar, the irony of which was not lost on him, to loosen the old man's tongue. Kane, the prospector, slurred, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He ain't no rancher. He's a ghoul. Buying up all the land. The land of the damned, he calls it. Says he's building a kingdom, a monument to his dead. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Kane wasn't after money or power. He was systematically acquiring every piece of land connected to the men he held responsible for his family's death. He wasn't building a ranch, he was building a massive mausoleum. He wanted to erase Cedar Falls, to wipe away every memory of the people who lived there and consecrate the entire valley to his grief. The unmarked graves of his wife and child were at the center of it all, and the land he inhabited, the land where he planned his vengeance, was the final, most important piece of his grim puzzle. This wasn't just a quest for revenge. It was a holy war. Jack was not just fighting a man. He was fighting a fanatic, a high priest of sorrow whose scripture was written in blood. The conflict had become a tragic mirror image, 2 grieving fathers locked in a battle over the ghosts of their pasts. The revelation shook Jack to his core. He retreated to the bluffs overlooking the sanctuary, his mind a whirlwind of grief and dawning horror. He watched the compound through his field glasses, and he saw him. Marcus Thorne standing beside Silas Kane, pointing at a map. He looked older, more severe, but it was him. And as Jack watched, Thorne reached into his pocket and absently began flipping a silver dollar, the metal catching the glint of the setting sun. It was true. The betrayal was real. The memory of the raid came back to him sharp and clear. Thorne insisting the informant was reliable. Thorne guiding them into the box canyon. Thorne, whose horse had conveniently gone lame just before the shooting started, keeping him at the rear of the column, out of the worst of the fighting. And afterward, it was Thorne who had identified the bodies of their fallen comrades, Thorne, who had filed the official report. He had orchestrated the entire disaster. But why? What could Kane have offered him that was worth betraying his marshal, his brothers in arms? And the most sickening question of all, was Thorne involved in what happened to Mary and Sarah? Did he give Kane the location of Jack's home? The possibility was a venom that spread through his veins, turning his grief into a cold, murderous resolve. He understood now. Kane's plan wasn't just to kill him. It was to strip him of everything, his past, his purpose, his very identity as a man of justice, before delivering the final blow. And Marcus Thorne, the man he had trusted completely, was the architect of his damnation. Silas Kane knew Jack was in the valley. He felt his presence like a change in the weather, an unwelcome specter disturbing the sacred silence of his grief. He had allowed Jack to simmer to discover the scope of his grand design, wanting him to understand the artistry of his vengeance before the end. But the time for waiting was over. Jack's presence was a contamination, and it was time to cleanse the valley. He sent Thorne into town with a message. Not for Jack, but for Eliza Reyes. Eliza was locking up the livery for the night when Thorne and two of Cain's men appeared out of the twilight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, her hand resting on her belly. Mrs. Reyes Thorne said, his voice polite but empty of warmth. He flipped his silver dollar. Catch, flip, catch. Mr. Cain has a final offer for your property. A generous one. He asks that you come to the sanctuary to discuss it. My answer is the same as always, Eliza said, her voice shaking only slightly. The livery is not for sale. Thorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid it wasn't a request. Before she could react, the men seized her. She fought back a fierce protective instinct surging through her, but she was no match for them. They forced her onto a horse, her cries for help swallowed by the empty streets of Cedar Falls. The message was delivered to Jack by a terrified stable boy who had witnessed the abduction from a hiding place in the hayloft. A simple, chilling sentence scrawled on a piece of paper. Come home, Marshal, or the woman and her child will pay for your sins. The last vestiges of Jack Callahan, the grieving recluse, burned away. In his place stood the U.S. Marshal, a man forged in duty and driven by a righteous fury. He was no longer fighting for the past. The locket, the memories, the ghosts, they were secondary now. He was fighting for the future, for the fragile hope embodied by Eliza Reyes and her unborn child. He checked his Colt, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hand. He took the rifle he had bartered for its stock, smooth and cool, against his cheek. As he prepared for his assault, the sky began to change. The air grew thick and heavy, the light turning a sickly yellow. On the horizon, a monstrous brown cloud was gathering, churning and growing. A sandstorm was coming, a biblical tempest for a biblical reckoning. Jack smiled grimly. Cain had his theatrics, but the desert itself was about to provide the final act. The sandstorm hit the valley like the wrath of God. A wall of roiling dust and sand descended, turning day into a suffocating twilight. The wind shrieked a symphony of destruction, tearing at roofs and scouring the very face of the rock. It was a force of pure, elemental chaos, and for Jack Callahan, it was cover. He approached the sanctuary on foot, a ghost in the gale. The guards, blinded and deafened by the storm, were easy targets. He moved from shadow to shadow, silent and lethal, the skills he had tried to forget, returning to him with a grim fluidity. 2 guards at the gate, 1 in the watchtower. He dispatched them with his knife, their surprised cries lost to the howling wind. He slipped inside the compound. The storm had created a disorienting, nightmarish landscape. Buildings were ghostly shapes, appearing and disappearing in the swirling dust. The air was so thick he could barely breathe. He moved by instinct, his knowledge of the layout pieced together from days of observation. He was heading for the main ranch house when a figure stepped out from behind a water trough, rifle raised. It was one of Cain's men, his face covered by a bandana. But even in the gloom, Jack recognized his stance. The man fired the shot, going wide in the gale. Jack dove behind a stack of barrels, the bullets splintering the wood where his head had been. He drew his Colt, the sound of the hammer clicking back unnaturally loud in a lull in the wind. "I know it's you, Callahan," the man shouted, his voice muffled. "Cain wants you alive. But Thorne said he'd pay double for you dead." Jack fired from the hip. The bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fired again, a clean shot to the chest. The man collapsed without a sound. He found the next two guards in the stables, trying to calm the terrified horses. They never saw him coming. He was a phantom, an extension of the storm's fury. He left them where they lay and continued toward the house. As he reached the porch, the front door swung open. Marcus Thorne stood silhouetted in the doorway, a shotgun in his hands. The wind whipped his coat around him, but he stood perfectly still, the silver dollar glinting in his hand. Flip. Catch. "I knew you'd come," Jack Thorne said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You always did have a hero complex." Marcus Jack said, his own voice a low growl. "Why?" Why, Thorne laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Because of you, Jack. You with your perfect record, your perfect family, your perfect life. You were a monument to everything I could never be. I was always in your shadow. Cain offered me a chance to have my own kingdom. All I had to do was help him burn yours down." Mary and Sarah Jack's voice was barely a whisper. "Did you?" "I gave him the directions," Thorne said, his face hardening. "They were part of the price. A man has to be willing to make sacrifices for his ambition." The cold fury in Jack's chest coalesced into a single point of ice. He raised his Colt. At the same moment, Thorne raised his shotgun. They fired simultaneously. The shotgun blast tore through the air, buckshot ripping into the porch post beside Jack's head. Jack's own bullet flew true, striking the silver dollar in Thorne's hand just as he flipped it. The coin deflected the shot, sending it whining into the sky, but the impact shattered the bones in Thorne's hand. He cried out in pain, dropping the shotgun. Jack was on him in an instant, tackling him back into the house. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and desperate rage. Thorne was strong, but Jack was fueled by a decade of repressed grief and white-hot hatred. He drove his fist into Thorne's face once, twice, a third time. He felt bone give way. He drew his knife, the blade pressed against Thorne's throat. "It ends now, Marcus," he snarled. Thorne just smiled, blood bubbling from his lips. "It ended a long time ago, Jack. He's been waiting for you." He nodded toward the back of the house. "Go see him. Go see what he's made you." Leaving Thorne broken and bleeding on the floor, Jack moved deeper into the house. He found Silas Cain in a large study. The room was a shrine. The walls were covered with maps of the valley, but also with sketches and portraits of a woman and a young boy, Cain's family. In the center of the room, on a velvet-draped pedestal, was the twisted, ruined silver of Jack's locket. Cain stood by the window, watching the storm rage. He turned as Jack entered, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked calm, serene, a man who had orchestrated his own apocalypse and was pleased with the result. And in a chair in the corner of the room sat Eliza Reyes. She was pale, her face beaded with sweat, her hands clutching her belly. Her eyes met Jack's wide with fear and pain. "Welcome, Marshal Silas Cain," said his voice smooth as poison. "Right on cue. You see, this was always the final act, not just your death, your damnation. I have to admire your persistence," Callahan Cain said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He seemed utterly unfazed by the dead men in his yard or the storm trying to tear his house apart. "But you've misunderstood the nature of this performance. You are not the hero. You are the villain. You, the righteous lawman who, in his blind arrogance, murdered an innocent woman and her child." "That was an accident," Jack growled, his pistol aimed squarely at Cain's heart. "A tragedy of war." War Cain laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "You call your bungled raid a war, I call it murder." And it demanded an equal response. An eye for an eye, a wife for a wife, a child for a child. His gaze flickered toward Eliza, and Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. She has nothing to do with this, Jack said. Oh, but she does, Kane replied, taking a deliberate sip of whiskey. She is the instrument of your final test. Your chance to become me. I took your family to show you the depths of grief. Now I give you the chance to save another. But to do so, you must kill me. You must embrace the rage, the vengeance. You must become the monster you created. Suddenly, Eliza cried out a sharp, ragged gasp of pain. She doubled over in the chair, her knuckles white as she gripped its arms. The baby. She panted, her eyes wide with panic. It's coming. The storm outside seemed to redouble its fury, the wind screaming like a banshee. The ticking clock of the robbery and the chase had been replaced by the most primal deadline of all. Kane's smile was predatory. You see, the stage is set. The drama unfolds. Save the mother and child Callahan. Avenge your own loss. All it will cost is your soul. Kill me. Become me. He set his glass down and slowly unbuttoned his coat, revealing the Colt holstered at his hip. Of course, he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Oh, there is one more detail you should know. A final twist for our tragedy. Thorne didn't just give me the location of your ranch. He gave me the one piece of information that ensured my men would succeed. He told me you would be gone that day, in Durango, testifying at a federal trial. Kane's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. You weren't there to protect them, were you, Marshal? While my heart was being torn from my chest, you were busy polishing your reputation. You didn't just lead me to them. You abandoned them. The word struck Jack with the force of a physical blow. It was true. He had been gone. He had always told himself it wouldn't have made a difference, that they would have overwhelmed him. But the guilt and the deep secret shame of his absence was a wound that had never healed. Kane had just poured salt in it. The psychological duel was over. Kane had laid him bare. Now only the physical one remained. With a speed that defied his calm demeanor, Kane drew his pistol. But Jack was faster. He had been waiting for this moment for 10 years. His shot was pure instinct, a straight line from his rage to Kane's gun hand. Kane's pistol clattered to the floor, his hand a bloody ruin. He staggered back, his face a mask of shock and pain. He was disarmed, helpless, at Jack's mercy. Jack stepped forward, his own Colt rock-steady aimed between Kane's eyes. This was the moment, the culmination of a decade of grief. The end of the road. He could pull the trigger. He could feel the rightness of it, the terrible satisfaction. Eliza cried out again, a longer, more desperate sound that cut through his red haze of vengeance. He looked from Kane's hateful, broken face to Eliza's contorted in the agony of childbirth. Life and death hanging in the balance. In that instant, he saw the choice clearly. Kane wanted him to choose death to validate his own twisted philosophy. To kill him would be to let Silas Kane win. Slowly, deliberately, Jack lowered his pistol. No, he said, his voice quiet but firm, I am not you. He turned his back on the stunned Silas Kane and went to Eliza's side. He knelt before her, his hands, which moments before had been ready to deal death, now reaching out to offer comfort. Breathe, he said softly, his voice gentle. Just breathe. I'm here. You're not alone. The choice was made. He had chosen life. He had chosen a future. And in that choice, he found a redemption that no act of revenge could ever have offered. The marshal was gone. The grieving widower was gone. In their place was just a man, helping to bring a new life into a world that desperately needed it. The sound that broke the stalemate was not a gunshot. but the wail of a newborn baby. It was a thin, furious sound, yet it cut through the howl of the sandstorm and the thick silence of the room with the force of a thunderclap. Jack, his hands clumsy but gentle, wrapped the infant in a strip of clean cloth torn from a curtain. He placed the baby boy into Eliza's waiting arms. Her face, exhausted and tear-streaked, lit up with a love so pure and powerful it seemed to push back the shadows in the room. Behind them, Silas Kane slumped against the wall, defeated not by a bullet, but by an act of mercy he could not comprehend. His empire of grief had crumbled, washed away by the raw, undeniable miracle of birth. As if summoned by the baby's cry, the storm began to break. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh, and pale light began to filter through the dust-caked windows. With the receding storm came the sound of approaching horses. A troop of federal marshals, alerted by a message Jack had paid a frightened telegraph operator to send before he left Cedar Falls, surrounded the ranch house. The law had finally come to the San Roque Valley. They took Kane and his men, including a whimpering Marcus Thorne, into custody. Kane offered no resistance. He was a hollow man, his grand performance over the audience gone home. A week later, Jack visited him in a cell at the federal courthouse in Durango. Kane sat on his cot, his wounded hand bandaged, his eyes vacant. "They will hang me," Kane said without preamble. It was a statement of fact, not a complaint. "Yes," Jack replied. They sat in silence for a long time. There were no words of forgiveness, no pleas for understanding. Their shared loss was a chasm between them that could never be bridged. But in that silence, there was a flicker of something else. A tragic mutual acknowledgement of two men who had let their grief define them, and the different paths they had chosen in the end. "Your son Kane," said, his voice a dry rasp. "Does he have a name?" "Mateo," Jack said, "after his father." Kane nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. It was the only crack in his carefully constructed facade. Months passed. The valley began to heal. With Kane's reign of terror broken, the land deeds he had acquired through intimidation and fraud were returned to their rightful owners. The people of Cedar Falls began to lift their heads, the oppressive fear slowly replaced by the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. Jack stayed. He helped Eliza run the livery, the simple, honest labor, a balm for his soul. They didn't speak of love or promises. Their bond was something quieter, deeper, forged in shared trauma and mutual respect. They were two broken people learning how to be whole again, side by side. One clear autumn morning, almost a year to the day since the stagecoach robbery, a package arrived from the U.S. Marshal's office. Inside was a small velvet bag. Jack opened it. The silver locket fell into his palm. It had been repaired. The dents were smoothed out, the hinge fixed. The delicate portraits of Mary and Sarah were untouched, their smiles as bright and loving as the day they were painted. He rode out to the small cemetery on the outskirts of Durango, where he had buried them so long ago. The twin headstones stood side by side, silent and patient. He knelt in the grass, the locket cool and heavy in his hand. For years this object had been his prison, a constant, painful reminder of all he had lost. Now it was just a memory. A beautiful, precious memory, but one that no longer had the power to chain him to the past. He did not bury it. He did not throw it away. Instead, he gently placed the locket on the cool granite of Mary's headstone, letting it rest between their names. "Goodbye," he whispered. It was not a goodbye of forgetting, but of acceptance. A final, peaceful letting go. He stood up and walked away, not looking back. He rode back to Cedar Falls, back to the livery where Eliza was tending the horse's baby Mateo, laughing in a sling on her back. He returned to the sound of life, to the promise of a future. He was a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had chosen to walk back out into the sun.